Welcome back to my garage, and welcome back to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am in fact the Masked Mormon. Why do I wear a mask?
Were you burned by acid or something like that?
Oh no, it's just they're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future.
So we're back in my garage, and I've added a new toy to all my production tools. Hopefully you'll notice the lighting is a little bit better. I just got a ring light, so you can see my mask mug a little bit better. Last time we were here, we talked about tithing, and how expensive it was for people to pay. I hope you enjoyed it. Today we're going to do something a little bit different, where we're going to continue our discussion about tithing just a little bit. I'm going to be a little bit more off the cuff. I didn't prepare a script like I do for some of my other videos, but today I'm going to be reading stories from Reddit users about their experiences or their loved ones' experiences with tithing. I want to thank those that contributed to their stories. If any of those were my viewers, thank you so much. I'll be using the usernames that people submitted under. Hopefully we'll be able to get a sense for how tithing works on the ground. There's something I wanted to read that I meant to with the last video, a quote, but I totally forgot to throw it in, and it totally slipped my mind until somebody brought it up. This quote comes from President Joseph F. Smith in April of 1907. In it he says, "We expect to see the day when we will not have to ask you for $1 of donation for any purpose, because we will have tithes sufficient in the storehouse for the Lord to pay everything that is needful for the advancement of the kingdom of God." So I don't know if that would be a prophecy or not, but I don't know how much the church needs to have in order to have sufficient to pay for all the things that the church needs to pay for. I don't know, I would think over $100+ billion would be tithes sufficient. However, like I mentioned in the last video, I think tithing is just too useful to the church to help keep the members attached, especially since it's tied to the temple recommend questions. If you can control somebody's access to the temple via tithing, that's just too useful. So without any more ado, let's get into some of these stories. The first one comes from Volcanic Ashes. Volcanic says, "My mother was disabled and on government assistance as her only income. So really, when members whine about leeches off the government, they should pay attention to how much government money is going to the church and tithing. My mom couldn't afford to pay tithing and feed us at the same time. She still got shit from the bishop over not budgeting properly, and that tithing should be her top priority. I remember once after one of those meetings, we had them a lot, my mom told him that she had $2 left in her wallet, so she'll put a quarter in the tithing envelope and they can keep the change. Ouch. She couldn't afford to feed her family and pay tithing at the same time. That seems to be the story that's so common, especially with poorer members of the church." The next story comes from Wait by the River. Wait says, "Back in the day, when I was a true blue believer, there was some politician pushing a flat tax. I remember hearing members compare the flat tax idea to tithing, loving it, and suggesting the church was the inspiration for the idea. I was proud to call myself a member at the time. Not until I was a young father paying tithing on a meager income did I finally realize that the flat tax idea was bullshit. 10% for me was not the same as 10% for higher earners. And all the sacrifice rhetoric just made me resent it all the more. I was a good member, worked hard, and came out of college earning a decent income, but that 10% slowed us down in ways that others who entered the workforce with higher entry-level wages didn't worry as much about." That's so true. The flat tax idea seems like a good idea on paper. The next comment comes from Nazgul. It's related to this last one. "I remember talking to two cool missionaries about after-mission life, marriage, etc. I told them that you have to make enough to break the tithing barrier. Basically, make enough money that 10% missing won't matter to you. If not, you'll be in debt forever." That is so true. There are people that struggle their entire lives because not only do they have the financial responsibilities associated with life, family, houses, cars, all that kind of stuff, they have the further burden of tithing that just weighs on them, so they can't put away money for retirement, for college, for savings in the future. Tithing really does put people behind. Gingabai says, "Yep, we've always been on a super tight budget, but last year, when we were still TBMs, our household income dropped due to COVID. All our bills went out on direct debit except tithing because we didn't have the ability to do that at the time. On our new income, we could thankfully still pay all our bills, but there was no money left for tithing. My husband literally had to go get a second job in the middle of a pandemic to be able to afford tithing. Now we've left, and I'm so pissed off about all the money we wasted when we desperately needed it." That is just insane, having to get a second job just to pay tithing. Oftentimes there's the adage that people can't afford not to pay tithing. Well, in this case, these people couldn't afford to pay tithing. If you have to get a second job just to pay your debts to the church, there's something wrong there. One highlight, 7231, says, "Governments recognize the hardship that flat taxes inequitably put on poorer citizens. But the church doesn't. Tithing already makes it take longer to save up for retirement, but for those already struggling to get by, it makes it impossible. Every cent of tithing from members in poverty is money that could have been spent on necessities or saved for the future time of need. Meanwhile, the church makes more than $100 per second in interest on their Ensign Peaks Fund." Like I said before, you could definitely do more with the money that you spend in tithing than the church could. The church just sits on it, letting it accrue interest. Mountain Lavishness 1 says, "It will deny temple access if you aren't a full tithe payer. I was active for almost 50 years. We had the Mormon 5, married young, struggled to pay tithing for a long time. Gradually made more money, and then started paying serious amounts of tithing. What a sham. When I look back and think about the huge amount of stress paying tithing put on our young marriage, what we went without, the total amounts I paid to the church while my kids didn't get certain things or had to borrow for college, I get really, really angry. All while the church was investing billions on the stock market and intentionally keeping it secret. The church is a parasite. It feasts on its members to bloat itself while dangling false blessings as a reward of obedience. It is sinister at its core. I really hurt for you. Paying for 50 years, who knows how much in tithing. One of the things I think that complicates it though is I don't know how much the top leadership knows. The Quorum of the 12 Apostles likely doesn't know how much is in the Ensign Peak Fund. The only ones who likely know are the first presidency and maybe the presiding bishop. And because it's gotten so big, they probably just don't know what to do with it. It's probably easier to keep it secret than to address the ever-growing elephant in their bank account. Here's one person who might disagree with some of the things that I've been saying. Mormon Voice says that, well, first of all, a man with no income pays zero tithing. That can be true. Those Social Security checks have already been tithed. Well, that depends on your bishop. Your savings have already been tithed. You would only have to pay tithing on the increase, any interest accrued, or additional sums inherited from others. And secondly, the church takes far better care of the elderly than any other church. There's some pushback from Chris Moovin, who says, "I disagree. There are churches out there with specific elderly ministries, including providing meals and health care at no cost. The church sometimes does okay with the elderly, but that's a huge blanket statement you've got there with no real metric to back it up." I'd have to agree with Chris here. I'd have to push back that the church takes better care of the elderly than any other church. Again, it probably definitely depends on the bishop and stake president, but in the last video I posed the question of, will the church take care of you when you get old? Of course, I think the answer is probably no. The church will take and take and take, and then when you need, they're nowhere to be found. Working for Progress 365 says that, "My husband and I always pay tithing on gross. I'm a stay-at-home mom now and just talk my husband into paying on net instead of gross. He wanted to check if this was okay with his father, who served as a bishop recently for 6 years. He doesn't trust my word since I'm basically physically and mentally out. Well, he found out that his dad pays on net. I always thought that paying tithing on gross was right. I always thought that paying tithing on gross was the right thing to do. But now, I think it's so silly. I started teaching piano lessons recently to a couple of students and made very little money. I still feel guilty about not paying tithing and haven't decided whether I will or not. I have to renew my temple recommend in the fall, and it's really hard for me to not be totally honest. Not looking forward to those interviews. This is a really weird, hard place that the church puts its people. The church puts a premium on people being honest in their dealings with their fellow men, but in return, the church isn't honest with their members. This woman feels guilty about not paying tithing on the meager amount of money she makes, and also feels guilty about not paying on gross. The church does a lot to put members in this hard bind, where they don't have enough to meet their basic needs, but they also want a temple recommend to go to the temple or attend a wedding or whatever, and so these people are kind of held hostage. Mormonologist says that my brother was a stake president in Vegas. His house mortgage was underwater. He stopped paying his mortgage for 2 years. He didn't stop tithing. The bank took his house away. Such blessings. Again, will the church take care of you in your time of need after you've sacrificed so much for it? Fortunately, again, I think the answer is no. Akamark says, when I lived on the East Coast, there was a family that always seemed to be struggling. They would bear testimony every month of their financial struggles and how by some miracle they received exactly the amount needed to fend off the current crisis. As far as I know, they're still alive and bearing testimony of their most recent blessing. I think those that help people like them are blessed. Personally, my family struggled to make ends meet until I stopped paying tithing. My believing wife really thought our demise was imminent when I decided to stop paying tithing. That hasn't happened. Opportunities have continued to open, leading to increased income and financial security. I now have almost a full year's worth of income stored in savings versus increasing credit card balances. Again, when you don't have enough to go around as it is, you can't put enough away for a future financial emergency if you are paying all of your discretionary income in tithing. This last story is a little bit longer, but it's from Il Kenobi. Back when I was in grad school, my ex-wife and I were living off student loans exclusively. No net gross tithing, no net or gross living, only deficit financials. There was no way I could work without jeopardizing my standing in school. Additionally, if I got a job and the admin of my program found out, chances are I would be kicked out or at least reprimanded and warned of the consequences of working and continuing in the program. While I was out of state for school, my ex and our 4 kids remained at home and financials became strained. Student loans were no longer enough to meet our basic needs. The church seemed to be the only option we had available, but we waited as long as we could before going to the bishop. My ex ended up meeting with the bishop after church one Sunday. The bishop looked at the student loans we received for the semester and told us we had to pay tithing on those loans before he would provide church assistance. Wow. All up front. That was money we didn't have room to depart with, but we trusted in the blessings the bishop promised and paid the tithing we were asked to pay so we could get the help we needed. How did things work out? Well, things continued to be tough for us throughout grad school, which is to be expected. But tithing blessings, right? My ex and I felt somewhat betrayed by the bishop and felt asking for tithing on student loans was out of line. So we got off church assistance as fast as we could. We'd rather go into much more debt than ask the church for assistance again. Eventually, I had no choice but to get a weekend job, taking call for a hospice company to help make up for what we were lacking. The hope was that by working weekends, things would somewhat The hope was that by working weekends, things would be somewhat quiet and I'd also get at least some studying time. I also made sure I didn't tell any of my classmates or admins of my program. One particular weekend, when I was on call, I got hammered with work. I was busy all weekend. I didn't get any studying in and had a major test on Monday. I ended up getting a C on the exam, but it put me 0.01 points below the GPA I needed to continue in the program. At the end of the semester, I was notified by the grad guidance counselor that I was no longer in the program. However, I would be allowed to stay in the program if I moved to Fort Worth, Texas, where my school was located, and repeated the entire first semester. I had to essentially improve my grades from that semester if I wanted to move on to the practical part of the program. We didn't have the money to move the entire family to Fort Worth. Additionally, all of our family was already nearby, and we needed them to help with our young kids. We had 4 of them. I ended up moving to Fort Worth and depending exclusively on the scant student loans we received and on the kindness of others. My takeaway from this experience and similar ones is that 1, the blessings that come from the kindness of friends, family, and complete strangers are far greater than the promises offered by tithing. These are the people that got us through such difficult financial time, not the church. Number 2, the church is a taskmaster when you are receiving church assistance. They can take control of your checkbook and make additional demands on your time, as if we have any more time to give. They care more about the money they are losing. They care more about the money they are losing than they care about helping a struggling active member. You become their slave as long as you receive their charity. I vowed to go bankrupt or live on the street than to take assistance from the church ever again. That's a pretty heavy story, and that reminds me of when I was an Elders Quorum president. I was in charge of doing financial assessments for people that were asking for church assistance. It was always a really difficult thing for me to go into their home and ask them about their finances. So they didn't know me, I didn't know them, but even if we did know each other, me going through their finances and saying, oh, maybe you shouldn't do this, or maybe you could lower that, was just kind of, it put me in a really weird position, and I could tell it was kind of humiliating for them. Once I started learning about how unethical tithing was, the next financial assessment I did was on some really close friends. They were becoming active in the church again, and they were wanting to go to the temple. So instead of guilting them on their poor financial management skills or on them not making enough money or whatever the church wanted me to do, I instead started talking to them about different options for paying tithing. We talked about the gross versus net model, but then I also went into a lot of detail about the surplus model, wherein after all of your needs are met, then you pay tithing on that, on what is left, which is how, as I read the scriptures, tithing was intended in the first place. After that meeting with these friends, you could see a huge weight lifted off their shoulders. All of a sudden, things felt possible for them. They wanted to be active in the church. They wanted to participate fully with the temple and all that, and all the things that entailed. I could tell that was super important for them. But they also couldn't afford tithing. They were working their fingers to the bone and still didn't quite have enough to make ends meet. Perhaps they could probably make better financial decisions, sure, but that's not for me to tell them. Instead, once we had that discussion, you could see that things seemed possible to them for the first time. They saw a way to be able to get to the temple and still pay tithing. I, of course, mentioned that most people probably wouldn't agree with this method of paying tithing, but that it was totally up to them how they wanted to do it. If they wanted to pay net, gross, surplus, or whatever, it was up to them. Tithing was only between them and God. And so, a few months later, they got temple recommends and were able to go to the temple. I think they enjoyed that experience, and I think for the first time they were able to participate fully in the church like they wanted to. How the church uses tithing as a control mechanism is something that kind of angers me. Look, I don't have a problem with churches or organizations asking for money. They have to run somehow. But my problem comes when it's tied to things like going to the temple or attending a loved one's wedding. It ends up pulling people apart instead of bringing people together. And honestly, it's something that harms people that don't make as much money or aren't as financially secure. The church preaches about self-reliance, but it really doesn't give people the tools to be reliant when they're paying a big chunk of their discretionary income to an organization that frankly doesn't need it. Well, the church does need you to pay tithing because it keeps you tied to the church, so it keeps you going to the temple, which keeps you tied to the church. It ends up being too useful to the church not to use it. So contrary to Joseph F. Smith's prophecy or whatever, talking as a man maybe, where he says, we expect to see the day when we will not have to ask you for another dollar of donation for any purpose, because we will have tithe sufficient in the storehouse for the Lord to pay everything that is needful for the advancement of the kingdom of God. I don't know when that day is going to come. It seems like it's already here, but I don't expect the church is going to change anything anytime soon. So what do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you like this, please press that like button and subscribe, and you'll see my mask mug again in that next video.